Hey, folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host, and have with me another great guest. This brother here is Dr. Stephen Meyer, and he's a philosopher of science, director of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute, and a New York Times bestselling author. That book was Darwin's Doubt, and he has a new book out, which I think is really going to make quite an impact. It's called The Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Scientific Discoveries that Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. Dr. Meyer, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on your program, Corbin.
Yeah. So before we get a little bit into your book, mainly letting my listeners know where they can buy your book, I want to ask a couple of questions. And one of the questions, I have a little bit of a personal investment in it. I have a daughter, and I noticed in some of your writings that you're stating that more and more young people in the United States are moving away from believing in the existence of God. Am I getting that right?
Well, right. The pollsters are picking this up. They call it they name the phenomenon the rise of the nuns, by which they do not mean Catholic ladies in habits. They mean religiously non-affiliated or unaffiliated agnostics and atheists, and they're finding that there is an increase in the percentage of the young population between roughly 18 and 30, of people who identify themselves as religiously unaffiliated and either agnostic or atheistic in their view. And what's really interesting to us is that when you probe that group of young people, you find that science has played an outsized role in the growing disaffection with religious belief, or specifically with theistic belief or Christian belief. And that, if, for example, 2/3 of young atheists have answered the question or say yes to the following statement: I agree. The findings of science make belief in God less probable or less likely. About 2/3 of young atheists see science, therefore, as a crucial factor in their atheism.
And so I know there are a lot of so-called atheist writers out there, such as Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Bill Nye. So it seems that their whole position that science, there's no...
It's sure not hard to see how young people over the last 15 years would have acquired the impression that science, properly understood, undermines belief in God, because that is precisely the message of these popular new atheist writers who have actually pioneered a new genre of literature in the publishing world. It's just, there's a whole raft of these new atheist books. And of course, the most popular and the probably the first big bestseller of that genre was The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And they're having a huge impact on the religious sensibilities of young people. And when young people are probed, they often parrot the kinds of arguments that they get from those books. That said, there's a lot to appreciate about the new atheists insofar as they really are dedicated to a particular metaphysical point of view, a particular worldview, which means they care about the big questions, and they often frame the issues extremely clearly. Dawkins says the universe has exactly the properties it should have if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. I appreciate that statement for 2 reasons. One, because it implies that worldviews or metaphysical hypotheses, his metaphysical worldview or system of thought is called materialism. That's what he means by blind, pitiless indifference. No design, no purpose, just molecules in motion are the fundamental thing that have always been here and that are responsible for generating everything we see around us. So his statement implies that a worldview can be tested or evaluated by looking at the universe around us, the world around us, and seeing if what we see matches what you'd expect if a given worldview were true. So that's very interesting, because that says, the evaluating worldviews is within the realm of rational discourse. I just happen to disagree with his claim that the properties that we see are consistent with materialism. In fact, the 3 scientific discoveries that I mentioned in the subtitle of the book, the universe had a beginning. It's been fine-tuned from the beginning to allow for the possibility of life. and that life at its foundational level contains information in a digital code, something like a machine code, as Dawkins himself acknowledges. I argue that none of those three hugely important discoveries are consistent with the materialistic worldview that Dawkins advocates. They're not what you would expect if blind, pitiless indifference were all that had been at work.
So when you talk about materialism, are you talking, I know with the philosophy of Marxism, Karl Marx, he talked about dialectical materialism.
Right.
Is that the same thing?
Well, dialectical materialism is a kind of a particular species of materialism that held that there was a kind of an inexorable advance to history that was driven by the economic needs and systems that economic needs that systems have, or economic needs that humans have, and the systems that they devised. But materialism generally, and a system sometimes called scientific materialism, is just the claim that that matter and energy are the foundational building blocks of all reality. There's nothing beyond the physical or material universe. So the universe of matter, space, time, and energy is all that has ever existed, and that matter and energy have within them the capability to self-organize into all the things that we see around us. Every worldview or system of thought has to answer what philosophers sometimes call the prime reality question. What is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else comes? And materialism has answered that in terms of matter and energy. That's those are the things from which everything else come. Whereas theism says there's a pre-existing mind that is personal and has intelligence and purposes for the universe, and that the universe arose from that pre-existing entity, namely God. So in the one worldview, you have matter first, and then mind arises later as a kind of epiphenomenon as a consequence of the evolutionary process that finally produced us. In the other worldview, you have mind first, and then matter arises from the intentions of a mind, and that mind shapes the matter into all the things we see around us. And this has been the great philosophical divide in Western philosophy, going all the way back to the Greeks. Are we idealists, where mind comes first, or are we materialists, where matter comes first? And I think the new discoveries of modern science are pointing in a decidedly theistic direction, as opposed to a materialistic one. I think they challenge materialism.
Okay, and so given that understanding of worldviews and what they're fundamentally based on, what does it matter? What does it matter if there's a God or if there isn't a God? What does it matter?
Well, the answer that any of us give to that foundational worldview question affects our thinking about pretty much everything else. I was a philosophy professor for a number of years, and I taught a course on basic worldviews. And if you answer the question that matter and energy are the thing from which everything else comes, it becomes pretty hard to devise a system of objective ethics, for example. Instead, if all ethical statements reflect statements of value, but it takes persons to value things. And if there's no ultimate person or objective mind behind the universe, then there can be really no objective ethics. Each person can have his or her own preference about what they think is right or wrong, or so it devolves quickly into a form of relativism if you're a materialist. On the other hand, if you're a theist, you can answer that question. What do we mean by ought? What we mean by ought is that there is a design for human flourishing, and that was given to us by our Creator, and therefore, when there is, ought refers to a standard of behavior or treating people with value and dignity that reflects the value that the Creator has assigned to individuals, and also something of the design that the Creator has for us for our flourishing. So just your ethical system, your views of ethics change dramatically as to whether you start with a personal Creator or start with matter and motion. Same thing with questions of human meaning. And we have an epidemic right now in the country of teen suicide. There was an article in the New York Times by a University of Pennsylvania psychologist at the Wharton School on the 19th of April, describing this sense that people have coming out of the COVID year, that their lives have no meaning or purpose. They're kind of languishing. And I think that's right, but I think there's some deeper reasons for that. And one of them is the so-called, what the philosophers have called the death of God. Nothing can mean anything to a rock or to an atom or to a planet. Meaning is something that is assigned by persons and found in relationship between persons. So if there is no personal source to our universe, if we're just the product of undirected, unguided material processes, then certainly we don't mean anything to the universe. And when we die, there will be no one left to which anything can mean anything. So many young people sense that there is no ultimate meaning to human existence. We weren't intended. There's no purpose to our existence. And that has a kind of corrosive effect on their psychology. There's a psychologist will diagnose people with anxiety, but I think in young people, and I suffered from this as a young person myself, I think many young people are experiencing a kind of metaphysical anxiety, wondering if there's any ultimate purpose to human existence, and if, beyond the few short years we each have on the planet, there's any significance to anything we achieve or anything we could possibly do or achieve. So I think the restoration, the scientific rediscovery of the reality of God, which is what my book is about, I think raises the possibility that what Viktor Frankl, the great Jewish psychologist, described as man's search for meaning in his famous book, that search need not end in vain. We may be able to find not just meaning in relation to each other for the short time we're here on Earth, but meaning in relation to a personal creator who brought us into existence and has the power to keep us in existence even after we die.
Wow, it's powerful. Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host. We have with us Dr. Stephen Meyer. He's just released the book, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 major scientific discoveries that point to God. Sir, we're not going to, I want people to read this. I want people to buy this book and read this book. I have a copy here. It's hardcover. And I can tell you right now, I'm going to be doing a lot of underlining in this book. I'm going to be writing a lot in the margins. This is a keeper, folks. I mean, you'll be able to refer back to it and back to it and back to it over the next several years. And I would highly recommend that graduations are coming up now, and highly recommend this as a graduation gift. Brother, where can we buy your book?
It's available, thanks for asking, on all of the major online distributors, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Indie Books, and Amazon.com, all those places and more. HarperCollins is the publisher, so it's at the Harper site as well. Mm-hmm. And then I have a website for the book called returnofthegodhypothesis.com, just the title, returnofthegodhypothesis.com.
Okay. returnofthegodhypothesis.com. And we can go there in addition to other places you just mentioned and buy the book. Are there other things that you offer on that particular website?
Oh, right. Well, from there, you can navigate to an author page and to the books page, the websites for the other 2 big books that I've written, Darwin's Doubt, which you kindly mentioned at the outset of the interview, and also a book I wrote prior to that called Signature in the Cell, which is all about the fascinating discovery of the digital code that's stored in the DNA molecule, and the problem that has posed to people trying to explain the origin of the first life from simple chemistry. I mentioned before that Bill Gates out here in Seattle is a kind of a local hero in our area because of his tremendous success with Microsoft, has said that the DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. We know that programs come from programmers. And we know, in fact, that whenever we find information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form, as we find it in DNA, and trace that information back to its source, it always comes to a mind and not a material process, whether we're talking about a paragraph in a book or a hieroglyphic inscription or information transmitted over a radio signal. Information is the product of mind. And so the discovery that information is running the show inside cells is a powerful indicator of a designing mind and the history of life. And that's one of the 3 big discoveries that I discuss in the new book, but I wrote a whole book about that called Signature in the Cell as well. So at the website, you can navigate between the book pages. There's also a YouTube channel that has lots of the debates that I've done, film debates that I've done with prominent neo-Darwinists or atheists, and then animations of some of the extraordinary stuff going on inside the cells, a little tiny miniature machine. So if you're interested in this topic, it's a great place to do a deep dive, and you can start with the Return of the God Hypothesis page and navigate back and forth to the other pages and YouTube channels.
And you mentioned YouTube, youtube.com, and we just put in Return of the God Hypothesis, or just put in your name and
you'll find me there. Right, exactly.
Okay,
Stephen Meyer with a PH. I think you.
Absolutely fantastic, folks, and I strongly encourage you to do all that the doctor just outlined. Brother, we've hit our limit here. Hopefully we can have you come back sometime. I mean, you'd mentioned you used to teach philosophy, was it? Is that what
I taught the philosophy of science at Whitworth University in Washington State, private liberal arts college, and left that to come full-time to Discovery Institute, where I'm directing this program in the Center for Science and Culture. And we have 40 affiliated scholars in many of the research projects that we support at mainstream universities. So we've got a lot of authors. Michael Behe, for example, has a new book out as well called Darwin Devolves. Douglas Axe, one of our top scientists who was at Cambridge, wrote a great book called Undeniable about the evidence of design. So we've got a lot of authors and scientists involved in this network. It's exciting intellectual movement.
Right. Well, I mean, I've read a few pages here in your book, and I have no doubt of that. I mean, I was saying to myself, my Lord, this is a college course right here in my hand.
Thank you very much. Well, you can hit us up for a degree. Well, I don't know if it'll be worth anything, but we'll give you some more letters after the name, right?
Right. But I'm sure it's not going to put me in any serious debt, but I would gain a heck of a lot more from going to your university.
Well, there's that. Yes, the student debt problem exactly.
But
we'll try to keep our readers out of that, just to give them knowledge without the big bill at the end of the rainbow.
You've accomplished that with this book here. I mean, it's worth its weight in gold. It's worth its weight in gold. Brother, we're going to conclude here. And hopefully we can have you come back sometime. And I just want to thank you again for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for reaching out, Corbin. I appreciate the conversation. Very good, in depth.